You learn the rhythm of the corridor by the bolts in the ceiling. When the field is cold, the bolts sit quiet in their sockets, paint crusted around them. When the generators come up and the gate blooms, each bolt picks up vibration, just enough to turn grit into a slow, crawling dust ring. You can feel power flowing before the status bars wake on the wall. On my first tour here, an older tech tapped one of those bolts with a wrench and told me, "If you ever see this thing start to turn, you hit the emergency dampers and you don't wait for permission. The corridor hates edges. It will shave them flat." That morning, the bolts stayed still. We were in spec. Throughput was steady. The bay sounded like any other shift. The transfer bay is a concrete canyon with ambitions of being a hangar. Gantries cross it at odd heights. Loading arms crouch along the walls like folded insects. Safety banners hang from the ceiling, stained with age and chalked incident numbers. Hazard tape snakes around pallets and stacks of stripped wiring, twisted beams and bundled paper pulled from the other world. At the far end of the hall, the gate sits in an oval frame, taller than a house, held in a cradle thick enough to stop artillery. From where I walk, the field looks like heat off asphalt in summer. It stands still and pretends to be flat. Cargo comes through on rails. Personnel walk. The company calls accidents variants, as if we harvest weather, not metal from a dead city. I walk the ramp with a tablet in my hand and try to make sure the load on each pallet matches the manifest that crossed my desk at the start of shift. On paper, I am Senior Corridor Operations Lead. In practice, I am the man who stands closest to the gate. The first inbound group that morning was a salvage crew boiled down to gear. Worn exosuits, helmets scuffed white where they'd scraped something harder than concrete, harness clips dotted with paint from previous jobs. I counted them as they cleared the field. Helmets, harness numbers, the broad outlines of faces. I glanced at the roster on my tablet and ticked them green. I've been counting bodies against lists my entire adult life. I used to do it on hot airstrips with dust in my teeth and figures whispering from the tail of a transport. Back then I learned how easily numbers lie. Now I count like the world is going to check my work. "Field is stable," Clark called from his station along the rail. His vest hung open, helmet in one hand, eyes on the gate's perimeter monitors. "Next pallet in 10. Clark ran safety. Mostly, he called me a pessimist and kept throughput high enough to keep the executives off our backs, right up until the day he needed me to be right. The next pallet nudged out of the shimmering oval with the slow, careful motion of something that didn't trust its own wheels. Stripped cabling lay bundled in loops, hacked down beams stacked underneath, cubes of compacted rubble wrapped in mesh. I walked along the rail, matching manifest fields to what I could see. Copper mass, compressed structural, archive paper. The bay roared with orders and machine noise. Overhead, a crane crept along its track, stuttered, then moved again. The corridor field throws off enough interference to make old motors nervous. The pallet rolled past. Something shifted under the top layer of cable. I almost let it go. Loads move, archives compress, scrap settles. Then I caught a glimpse through a narrow gap between mesh-wrapped bundles. A human eye in the shadow, wide and unblinking. I walked faster, cut across the yellow hazard lines, and planted my hand on the rail. "Hold the load," I called toward the control podium. The operator throttled back. The pallet eased to a stop. The crane's wheels squealed as the system compensated. Clark turned. "We have schedule, Arthur. Movement in the scrap." I tapped the side of the pallet. Up top, under the cable. Two small hands slid out between loops of wire, fingers pressed flat to the pallet deck, as if expecting it to open. A child's hands, thin but past infancy. Another hand followed and clamped the first. Between them, a face eased into view. A boy. His skin had the flat, underfed look our medics like to quantify in charts. Someone had cut his hair with a blade and no patience. "That isn't cargo," one of the handlers said under his breath. The boy's gaze skipped over my boots and went straight to the ceiling. He checked beams, lines, the crane track overhead, searching for places that looked unsafe. "Control, freeze the field," I called out. "Full stop on all inbounds." Across the bay, alarms chirped. The gate's glow dulled. The bolts above me stayed buried in concrete, but I watched them anyway. 2 more figures untangled from the scrap. Another boy, a little smaller, and a woman wedged between coils of cable. She slid out sideways, keeping her weight low, staying in the shadow of the top bundles as long as she could. Her clothes were stitched from fabric I didn't recognize. Not exotic, just wrong weave, wrong cut, nothing from any local supplier. Her eyes landed on my chest, took in the badge and company logo, then dropped to the concrete. Procedure is simple. Any unauthorized human from the other side counts as contamination. You sound the alarm. You get contamination control, medics, security, the whole ladder. You slam the corridor down and accept the hit to throughput because protocol is the only thing between you and whatever ended their world. I drew breath to start the alarm call. Julian Lockley stepped into the bay from the admin doorway like he'd rehearsed the timing. He didn't belong in a loading hall. His suit was dark and narrow, shoes too polished for this much dust. He walked with the easy confidence of someone who could make problems smaller just by changing the category they were filed under. "Hold your alarms!" he called, his voice cutting clean under the mechanical noise. "Operational pre-clearance on that load." The words hit like dropped metal. Clark tugged his headset away from his ear. "Pre-clearance on unmanifested humans? Sensitive human assets," Julian corrected as he crossed the hazard lines without looking at them. "Covered under special contract. Check your messages, Clark." My tablet pinged. A new document waited in my queue, stamped with a recognition code I'd never seen. The woman stood very still, shoulders slightly rounded, hands on the boys' backs. She watched the ceiling more than the men. I moved closer to the pallet, slow enough not to spook anyone. One of the boys flinched when my boots scuffed the deck. Under the back of his shirt, just above the collar, ran a thin line of pale scar tissue along his spine. Midway along that line, a small, hard bulge sat under the skin, about the size and shape of a coin stood on edge. I forced my eyes back to the manifest. Julian reached me and angled his tablet so only Clark and I could see. "Special authorization from corporate security," he murmured. "These 3 are operational guides on a sealed recovery project. They don't trigger contamination protocol. You keep eyes on them, log them under attached assets, and keep the corridor running." "Refugees are explicitly banned," I said. "We don't bring live bodies over from their side, that's the point." He smiled without humor. "We bring our crews back all the time. They count as live bodies. Crews start on this side. This goes the other way," I said. "That rule stays clean for a reason." Julian flicked to another screen. It showed a summary of my past, reduced to a line of text. Disciplinary Inquiry, Logistics Division, Foreign Deployment. Discrepancies between manifest and survivors on the tarmac. Considered for prosecution. Resolved with reassignment. He watched my eyes as I read it. "You remember what it costs to reopen old numbers," he went on, calm. "The company buried certain files for you. It can unbury them just as easily. We both know nobody walks away clean if that happens. Or you can sign a supplemental and classify this as a controlled exception. Then you can stand close to the gate and keep worse things from leaking through. Which option keeps more people alive, Stone?" The older boy shifted behind him. The small bead under the skin of his neck lifted, pushing against the thin fabric as the dormant gate behind us shivered along its edges. The motion was slow and precise, like a compass needle finding north. Nobody else seemed to notice. My thumb hovered over the alarm acknowledge. My other hand tightened on the tablet. The cursor blinked over the supplemental log entry. Sensitive human assets. Attached operational guides. On my previous posting, one line on a screen, one wrong number, had left men on a runway under a foreign sky. Those bodies haunted me every time I watched a pallet emerge from a light that linked to another dead place. The same choice in a new pattern. I keyed in my authorization and signed. The alarm light at my station flipped from armed to standby. Across the bay, normal status indicators resumed their crawl. Our medic team still needs to clear them, I told Julian. If they're carrying a pathogen, attached asset won't stop it. Of course, he said. We aren't unreasonable. Get them processed, logged, and moved off my deck. And keep food moving to that gate, Arthur. We have contracts to meet. He turned away, already back on his message stream. Medics arrived with their carts and hand units. Their uniforms belonged here. They had the weary focus of people used to triage in a place where reports avoid the word injury. They ran scanners over the woman and the boys, checked reflexes, hydration, basic vitals. One medic lifted the shorter boy's shirt to inspect the pale line along his spine. The bead under his skin shifted under her fingers, then settled. She recorded something, frowned at the numbers, then moved on. The woman kept her gaze low, answering questions in halting, almost familiar words. Our languages were close enough that every second word made sense. When a medic asked about the scars, she only touched the back of her neck and glanced, briefly, toward the gate, which shimmered at low power. When the formalities ended, a pair of facility guards led the three toward the exit. The older boy looked back once. His eyes slid past men and machines and fixed on the gate. Under his skin, the bead rose in a neat line toward his skull, pulled by something I couldn't see. The field pulsed gently in its frame, vertical and steady. He shivered and ducked his head. The bead eased back down. I watched them go and felt the ink drying on my digital signature. On paper, I had expanded the definition of cargo. In practice, I'd turned the corridor into a door for people who weren't supposed to exist on our side. The choice felt like plugging a leak with my bare hand. I told myself it was a paperwork fiction. I told myself staying inside the process kept things safer than pretending not to see. I told myself a lot of things as the next pallet bumped through the gate and I lifted my tablet to start counting again. Compromise walks beside you long enough, it starts to look like procedure. I went through the gate 3 shifts after that. Usually I stayed on our side. My job was to watch the wound, not walk into it. Then Julian waved a priority memo under my nose, and suddenly I was in a suit, helmet clipped to my harness, boots heavy on the ramp. Senior oversight, he explained. Client wants a safety responsible present on the ground. You have the most hours logged at the gate. That's a compliment, in our language. Do they know how it went last time I supervised bodies around a transport? He shrugged at the ceiling. They know you're thorough. Take it as a second chance if you want. Just bring back what they're paying for. The salvage team waited under the gantry, gear checked twice over. A security squad stood near the rail, armor matte under the bay lights, rifles low. Behind them, in a loose cluster, a handful of men and boys in mismatched clothing leaned against the wall. Their shirts pulled tight over faint lines along their spines. One of them stepped forward when he saw me, Jace. He'd arrived 2 weeks earlier on a pallet, much like the one that brought the woman and boys. His spine scar was thicker, more raised, and one shoulder sat a little higher than the other. You are gate man, he said, nodding once. You will walk there this time. Someone has to keep your coordinates honest. I checked the indicator on his collar. Contracted guide, not refugee. Another fiction. You sure you want to go back into that city? There are people behind us who want roofs that do not move. He tilted his head toward the bay door where others waited unseen. To get them, we trade what we know. This is simple. Nothing about it was simple, but we both had roles. At full power, the gate fills your vision even through a visor. The light isn't bright, just absolute. It flattens depth into suggestion and then takes even that away. You walk toward a vertical river that refuses to move aside. I walked. The field crawled across my visor like static. There was the familiar sense of my insides reorganizing into a pattern I had no words for, then grit under my boots and a sky that didn't belong to my planet. The first thing I noticed was the silence of things that should be moving. We stepped into a street where asphalt had sagged in long waves around circular craters. Building fronts leaned over us, ribs of exposed steel catching grey light. Many towers still stood, but smooth channels ran through them from ground level to upper floors. Like drills, the width of rooms had bored straight through and taken anything that fit. Rail lines along the median twisted upward into arcs that stopped mid-air, cut clean before they could curve back down. In a plaza, the ground showed a ring of pale concrete where something had burned away a perfect circle of surface and several layers below. I swept the street with my eyes, matching landmarks to the briefings I'd read. The dead city looked almost like ours. Advertisements peeling from walls in a language close to mine. Battered vehicles rusting at the curbs. The familiarity ended quickly. "Keep under cover when possible," Jace reminded us. "You move in the open. You move fast. You do not stand and look up." His tone carried the weight of a rule repeated until it became instinct. We took a covered route, cutting between skeletal trucks and under broken overhead walkways. Dust in the air made the inside of my helmet feel dry. The sky stayed empty of birds. Nothing stirred in the gutters. Walking through it felt like stepping into a photograph, frozen, scrubbed of small motions. Above, the cloud layer sat wrong. Not wrong in any mystic way, just layered in a pattern my weather training distrusted. Patches thinned and thickened without following wind. I found myself checking it the way the refugees checked ceilings. Often, involuntarily. We reached a metro entrance that dropped below street level. The rails no longer carried trains. They carried people who refused to stand under open sky. Barricades made from torn seats, doors, and scrap-blocked side tunnels. Light came from a mishmash of battery lanterns hung low, as if that too belonged to their defense. Families packed themselves into niches under stairs, under beams, under any overhead structure that felt solid. When I saw a clear shaft from floor to ceiling, it was empty. Jace led us to a cleared platform. In the center, the concrete showed a discolored ring a few paces across. The surface melted and re-solidified. "Keep off that," Jace warned. "It remembers what touched it." One of our security men snorted in his helmet, but skirted the circle anyway. He might mock the superstition, but he didn't trust this ground either. Children peeked from behind piles of luggage and improvised screens. A faint scar line and a small bulge showed along each spine. Some had tied bits of metal to strings and hung them from the low ceiling. Discs and loops that clinked together. Their shapes matched the curve of the beads along their backs. "You did this to yourselves?" I asked Jace quietly when we had a moment by a sealed door. "The implants." "Our council," he said. "They called it a defense, devices that listen for when the sky machinery wakes, so we can hide before it begins. That was the promise." "Did it work?" "We are speaking," he said, mouth twisting. "Many are not. The more they tuned these things, the more the owners above learned how to tug at us. We stayed under roofs. They took the roofs. I thought of twisted rail arches on the surface, the smooth channels through towers, the ring on the platform where no one stepped. "What do you mean, owners above?" He pointed toward the station's ceiling, as if through concrete and earth. "They came first as tools," he said. "Equipment in orbits that made sense. Then their paths changed. They stopped moving around and stayed over certain places. Lines started coming down. They took metal, power stations, anything in the way. Ground is only useful to them as something to reach through." "And the beads?" "In the first year they were optional." He flexed his shoulders, as if feeling old ache. "Third year, mandatory for those in key roles. Fifth year, they began to appear in children without procedures. Our medics said bodies had learned to grow them, or something else had learned how to grow them using us. He saw my reaction and shook his head. We do not know, he said. We only know that when the sky clears in certain patterns, you stay close to the ceiling and you hold still. A boy near the edge of the platform stiffened. His hands flew to his back. A murmur passed through the camp. People set down whatever they were carrying and moved. They stepped out of open floor and tucked themselves under beams, stairs, overhangs. No one wasted breath on warning or panic. The pattern was already in their muscles. Above us, through a cracked skylight near the old entrance, the clouds thinned in a neat circle. A darker shape lay inside the opening, far higher than any building and much too still for weather. I remembered the way those rails on the surface had lifted, then stopped where some invisible limit ended. On a crate near my knee, a handful of loose screws tipped up onto their heads, drawn by some faint force more interesting than gravity. The boy pressed himself flat under a concrete beam. The bead along his spine bulged in a hard line from neck to waist, then subsided in jerks like something losing interest. The dark patch drifted on. Clouds closed over it. Screws relaxed back to the concrete. People exhaled as part of the drill, not in relief. There, Jace said. The owners above. That is why we live underground now. Our team went to work. Salvage operators followed Jace to locate sealed rooms with paper archives, batteries, metals worth hauling. Security watched the camp and tunnel mouths. I stayed near the ring on the platform, logging structures and hazard patterns, recording angles between this station and the gate position topside. The company's interest made sense. This place held material and knowledge. The refugees' fear of the sky made just as much sense. On our break, Jace slid onto a crate beside me. There is a place under the old power hub, he said, voice low, deep. They built many frames there for people like us. Most are empty now. Some still hold bones. Your company will want to see it. If it's that valuable, why trade it for passage? We cannot eat bones, he said. We cannot sleep forever in tunnels. The world above us is hollowed. We can stay and slowly vanish, or we can trade what we know for a door into your world. His gaze tracked toward the line where the gate field marked our route home, even though he couldn't see it from here. We choose the door. How many of you left on your side? He blew out a thin breath. Enough to fill a few more pallets if we are careful. Not enough to trouble those things in the sky. They stopped counting us a long time ago. When we were ready to haul, Jace brought me an offer. Coordinates for those deeper vaults in exchange for passage for part of his camp. Official policy left no room for that. The corridor existed for cargo, not population transfers. Policy had already bent once under my hand, and Julian had built a quiet pipeline around that bend. I saw it now in the way medics looked away when certain pallets moved, in the way guards ignored specific doors. Choose who goes, I told Jace. We can only hide so many under the scrap. He chose quickly. A handful of boys, one thin older man who'd once been a technician, a young mother alone. They pulled on extra clothes and climbed onto a pallet already loaded with compacted metal and cable. Tarps covered them, heavy and close, leaving narrow gaps near the floor. I logged them as attached assets, temporary transfer, local guidance. My signature went in the same place as before. As we rolled the pallet toward the gate, Jace walked beside me. Your sky still does not know them, he said. Do not help it learn. You think we can hide a whole planet? We thought the same. He glanced at the low tunnel ceiling, then toward the route to the surface. It is not about hiding everything. It is about teaching them as little as possible. Your gate is new to them. Each time it opens, they learn more. I didn't put that in my report. There was no field on the form for the way his eyes lingered on the cross of my harness straps, on the place where my body intersected the imagined path of our corridor. The pallet rolled into the light. The field swallowed it, scrap and human bodies pressed together. Somewhere between one world and the next, a string of beads and a man who'd handed me coordinates crossed a path nobody had written protocols for. I went after them, counting. The storm started a week later. By then, the pipeline was routine. We gave it no official name, but everyone in the bay knew that certain pallets went to specific teams, that some runs brought back more bodies than the roster showed. Refugees moved into dorm blocks near the facility, ceilings low and walls thick. They slept under bunk frames, in storage alcoves, in the wedges between structural beams. They treated our windows like open pits. I was on shift in the observation gallery when the first anomaly hit. The gallery sits above the transfer bay, glass-fronted with a clear view of the gate. Consoles line one wall, monitors stacked 3 high with feeds from the dead city, drone footage, corridor metrics, and a live weather radar for our region. Outside, rain hammered the roof. An ordinary storm day until a cell parked itself directly above and refused to move. "Radar's lagging," the weather tech muttered. "Model says this system should have drifted east 3 hours ago. Instead, it's sitting over us like it bought the lease." On another monitor, the feed from the parallel Earth showed the usual grey overcast above the far side anchor. Then the clouds parted in a neat circle and held. Inside that circle, hanging far above the dead city, were shapes. They matched nothing as simple as aircraft. They were the length of office blocks, clustered around invisible axes, each body built from stretched, repeating segments joined by taut lines. Think construction cranes for giants, suspended horizontally with cables pointing straight down. There was no base, just those structures fixed in layered sky while the clouds slid around them. I'd seen sketches from Jace and others. None of them captured the scale. Along the back wall, a group of refugees watched. The company had let them up earlier as a gesture of goodwill for a camera crew that had already left. Now, as the storm stayed locked over us and the clearing froze above their old world, they stared at the monitors. One boy, about the age of the child on that first pallet, made a thin sound and backed into the wall. His hands clamped over his spine. The bead under his neck rose in one smooth line, each vertebrae along his back showing as a small ridge. They never glanced at the actual window. Every eye stayed on the screens, showing sky. "You all right?" a medic asked, stepping toward them with a scanner. "Under," Jay snapped from the corner. "Under, all of you." The refugees moved as if pulled by one cord. They pressed themselves under the lip of the console banks, under structural beams, under anything overhead. A man wedged himself under a narrow shelf with practiced ease. On radar, the storm cell above our facility swelled and thinned, its core still pinned to our coordinates. On the far side feed, the hanging shapes remained perfectly still. The medic lifted her scanner toward the boy whose beads still stood out like a chain of coins. The device chirped, the numbers climbing. "Those readings, log them under transient adjustment," an administrator called from the doorway. "Then scrub the raw data from the shared drive. Legal doesn't want graphs on this until security frames the narrative." "Transient adjustment," the medic repeated. Her fingers hovered over the save field as if she knew exactly what the label meant. I watched the boy's back. As the radar scale shifted and some subtle change passed through the sky, the beads flattened. He sagged against the wall, breathing hard. Clark leaned on the rail beside me, eyes on the gate. "Field is nominal," he said. "No variance on throughput. Technically, we have no problem." "Any perspective that includes a sky says otherwise," I told him. "Shut it down then." He jerked his chin toward the controls. "You're senior ops. Pull a hard stop if you think we're about to lose the roof." "We have executives on site," I reminded him. "They don't like hard stops." The door slid open. Julian came in with 2 visitors behind him, their suits brighter, their shoes even less suited to this much concrete. "Impressive, isn't it?" he began for their benefit, gesturing at the far side feed. Our corridor reaches across not just space, but abandoned infrastructural layers few have ever seen. We're monitoring closely for any interaction with local fields. One visitor frowned at the radar display. That storm cell is stationary. A quirk of local geography, Julian replied without blinking. We sit in a valley between transmission corridors. It pins certain systems in place. He glanced at me for half a heartbeat, then looked away. He knew he was inventing. He knew I knew. That never slowed him. Later that day, we tried a low-intensity transfer. A single pallet, no personnel. Enough field to see how the corridor behaved under that watching sky. I took my usual place on the ramp, close enough to catch anomalies. The bolts gave me no warning. The field looked normal, a vertical blur in the armored frame. When the pallet's leading edge crossed the boundary, something inside my chest tugged upward. It wasn't the standard gate sensation. Normal transit feels like a missed step. This felt like a steady pull, thin and focused, as if a wire inside my torso had been hooked and someone overhead was giving it a slow, curious lift. My heels lightened inside my boots. For an instant, I thought I was about to leave the floor. I grabbed the safety rail. The force cut off. The pallet finished its transit. Gate metrics stayed within acceptable limits, and no one else reacted. "Trip?" Clark called. "You're not generally the clumsy one." "Wet patch," I said, my fingers still locked on the rail. "Deck coating's peeling again." He snorted and turned back to his displays. My heart stayed steady because I'd trained it that way. Somewhere above the roof, along that storm-held column, something had tugged at the line between my bones and the sky. They were learning. Not just our geography, but our field, our bodies, and what walked through. I had no name for what watched us. I knew a calibration test when I felt one. We should have shut the corridor down then, killed the gate, iced the generators, welded the frame, and buried the scar. Instead, we started losing time. The first report came from a team in a mid-level office block. Their suit cameras showed them moving through dust and sagging cubicles, flashlights cutting clean cones. Then, for several minutes, the footage changed. Dust motes froze in the air. The team's movement slowed to an unnatural crawl. Voices stretched into low, drawn-out tones, like someone circling a finger around a glass rim. The men swore that from their perspective, they walked at normal speed, talked, and checked instruments. The only hint of anything odd had been the sun's position when they stepped back outside. On our side, they came through the gate with burns along forearms and shoulders, straight, parallel bands that cut through fabric and skin. The marks were too clean for shrapnel and the wrong angle for falling rubble. Each welt matched another on the opposite arm, as if they'd brushed thin lines strung across their path. Conduit abrasion, our medics labelled it, minor, treatable. They wrapped the injuries and filed them as contact with legacy infrastructure. I sat in a dark room with no windows and watched the helmet footage 12 times. During the slowed interval, their spines did something strange. Muscles along their backs twitched in tiny, synchronized increments, almost invisible under fabric. Frame by frame, it was nothing. Scrub back and forth, and it turned into a pattern, nerves responding to something beyond the visual field. The movement mirrored the way the refugees' beads shifted when the sky changed. I requested new imaging protocols for anyone returning from the far side with vertigo, headaches, or odd dreams. On the form, I called it post-transit fatigue. The imaging tech rolled his eyes when I brought him the first refugee boy whose bead had misbehaved in the gallery. "You're chasing ghosts, Stone," he said as he slid the boy into the scanner. "We're running at half staffing. You add extra scans on every nervous kid, we'll be here until next century." "Do this one," I told him. "If it's clean, we adjust." The first pass appeared on his monitor. A rendered spine, vertebrae glowing in layers. Along the column ran faint, bright nodes that didn't match bone or normal neural tissue. They lit in sequence, a soft wave rising and falling. The tech leaned closer. That isn't... The nodes flared. For a moment the pattern sharpened, as if something on the far side had pushed more power through a noisy channel. Every indicator on the console spiked, then slammed back to baseline. The image flattened. The nodes disappeared, leaving ordinary anatomy. "Machine glitch," the tech said too fast. He cleared the screen. "I'll recalibrate. These units go off after a brownout." "Save that frame," I told him. "Raw. Tag it." "Protocol says corrupted output gets dumped." He avoided my eyes. "You want legal on me as well as on yourself?" I left him with that and went to my terminal. By the time I reached the central archive, the scan had been replaced by a note. "Sample discarded due to artifact contamination." Attached, a clean image from a later run, as unremarkable as any textbook. The access log showed someone else's credentials on the deletion line, a level above mine. Someone higher up had already decided those nodes didn't belong in permanent storage. The next day, a salvage run became something else. The squad was coming back from low tunnels under the dead city, pallets loaded with compacted archive boxes and batteries. Halfway through the field, something invisible snapped in from above. On the bay monitors, it appeared as thin streaks of white shooting down across the gate aperture and into the hall, too fast to be hardware. Several streaks swept through overhead beams, carving shallow glowing grooves. Others grazed the pallet edges and sliced anchor points from the ceiling. One line caught a returning worker square in the harness. His body jerked upward, boots leaving the platform as if a cable had grabbed his spine and hauled in. He rose in a straight path, limbs flailing, until he hit the active field at the top edge of the aperture. For an instant, his silhouette burned there, half in our world, half in the corridor. Then he vanished. His harness rained down in torn pieces. A streak of blood hung where his body had been, stretched thin, then fell in broken arcs. "Dampers!" My voice tore out of me, but Clark was already slamming the controls. The gate stuttered. Field strength dropped in steps. The streaks winked out, leaving scorched lines in metal and concrete. The pallet crashed down, cargo scattering. By sheer accident, most of the squad was either fully in or fully out when the intrusion hit. Only the man in the harness stood exactly where the intruder wanted him. We locked down the bay for 18 hours. The internal bulletin called it equipment failure leading to a fatality in a restricted zone. No mention of lines reaching from above. No note about a body taken straight up. The footage vanished from general access within a day. Only a handful of us had seen the raw version. Whatever hung in the sky over that dead city had found the other end of our corridor. It was exploring from our side. The corridor was no longer just a door into a ruined place. It had become a handle they could grasp. Corporate response came polished and lethal. They called a meeting in a glass room 2 levels above the bay, the one with carefully chosen views of the facility. Clean angles, safe activity. Executives from the parent conglomerate filled half the chairs. They brought charts. Projected on the main wall, revenue projections for expanded operations climbed in polite slopes. Dotted lines showed potential growth if auxiliary gates went up near major cities. "The demand is clear," one executive said. "Resources, data, migration services, governments are interested. Competitors are working on prototypes. We cannot retreat because of a few anomalies." "A man was dragged straight up and taken apart in our bay," I said. "We've got burns whose geometry matches those things in the sky. Refugees with implants meant as defenses that turned into conduits. A storm anchored over this facility and an opening above theirs. These don't look like rounding errors." "Every transformative technology carries risk," another replied. "You served, Stone. You know that." "In uniform, when the enemy starts examining the barrel you shoot from, you don't give them more barrels." Laughter flickered and died. Julian shifted in his chair, angling his tablet so I could see my old disciplinary file glowing there. The one recording the manifest that didn't match the men who walked off the aircraft. The file the company had buried when they gave me this job. "These expansion nodes go ahead," he murmured while someone else talked about risk mitigation. "The board already committed. The question is how we word the safety certifications. You want my name on them? You watch the gate. Regulators like signatures from men with combat on their record. It reassures them. You understand loss." "I understand loss," I said. "The acceptable part has always belonged to men in your chair. You remember the inquiry?" His eyes stayed on the presentation. "If the company pulls its support from your case, old questions reopen. Imagine how that looks to our government partners. Disgraced officer at the center of our flagship technology. Or," he flicked to another screen, "you sign a carefully worded statement saying the anomalies are understood and manageable with overhead shielding. You add your recommendations. You keep your seat near the controls. Men like me don't win fights against men like him in rooms like that." In the end, I signed. I added clauses requiring heavy overhead plating at all new sites, minimum clearances between field apertures and any place humans stood. I wrote protocols to keep people away from open shafts, skylights, any straight line from floor to sky near an active gate. On paper, those were safety measures. In practice, they were borrowed talismans from refugees who clung to ceilings as lifelines. The corporation took my terms, smiled in public, and handed the underlying physics to their research teams. They learned as much from my caution as from any bold move. They weren't alone in learning. A week later, I followed Jace into the deep place he'd traded coordinates for. We went below the metro, down staircases where rails had once carried trains, past doors welded by some long-gone authority. Helmets lit faded diagrams on the walls, warnings in his language. "They built this when they believed they could tune the sky," he said as we passed a final security gate with its locks torn away. "We were going to sing back to the machines, match their frequencies, confuse them. Did you? We got their attention." His crooked shoulder lifted. The main chamber stretched in rows. Metal frames stood in lines, built to hold human bodies on their backs. Most lay empty. Some still held bones, long since cleaned. Dark, coin-sized devices clung to each spine. In the center of the ceiling, a circular void rimmed with scorched metal marked where something heavy had once moved. Torn connectors near the walls suggested cables that had hung from that ring. Our techs moved through the chamber with quiet awe, cameras and scanners working. Their instruments clicked faster near the remains. My own body started to answer. A lightness traced along my spine, sharp enough to map each vertebra. Standing under that central circle, I felt the familiar tendency to lift, as if some old command had found a new target. Jace watched me. "You feel it," he said. "What did they run through here?" I asked, eyes on the torn ring. "Power, signals, hope." He shrugged. "Then panic. Then they locked the doors and left people like us in the tunnels." Hero, one of our technicians, swept his handheld sensor past my torso, amused. "Let's see what our senior ops puts out," he said. The device chirped sharply. Numbers jumped higher than any background reading near the frames. Hero stopped smiling. He checked calibration and swept it across me again. The spike repeated. "What did you pick up on runs where I stayed on our side?" I asked. "Nothing." The implication lay there like another piece of scrap. The refugees' beads answered the sky. Their implants had once tied to this ceiling ring. Something above both worlds had pushed enough current through the corridor to lay new pathways into bodies like mine. "You stand where doors want to be," Jace said quietly. "Be careful where you linger." He kept his distance after that, as if proximity itself carried risk. When we returned, the forecast already held a storm over the main facility. Demonstration day arrived like a scheduled accident. The new auxiliary gate rose near a major city, wrapped in polished cladding and viewing galleries. Officials, investors, and selected media filled platforms designed to look strong and reassuring. They were about to watch their first live city-adjacent resource corridor. I wasn't invited. Instead, I sat in the control room at the original facility, eyes on a wall of displays. My job was to keep the master gate in a passively active state, ready to carry load if the new node needed support. That was Julian's line. "Redundancy," he said. "You know this beast better than anyone. If there's a hiccup, you'll see it." He didn't say the other part. If something broke, it would break first where the system was oldest and most scarred. That was where they were most willing to take a loss. Outside, the storm cell over our facility had never truly left. It thinned, shifted, and came back, like weather orbiting a drain. On the morning of the demonstration, it thickened again, layering itself over us. Reports came in from the city of a twin formation pinned above the new gate complex. In the refugee dorms, men and boys woke with headaches. The boy from the observation gallery collapsed in a corridor, his back arched like a drawn bow. Nurses rolled him onto a mattress, trying to keep his head safe. Beads along his spine stood out in a hard chain. His whole body trembled in small, precise steps, like an instrument receiving test signals. "Seizure," a medic said, kneeling with a scanner. "Could be stress." "This is not stress," Jace said from the doorway, arms folded. On my boards, the panel for the new gate showed the demonstration hall, the shimmering oval framed in gleaming metal, executives at a podium, an audience in rows. Flags hung along the walls, the field brightened. Outside feeds showed the storm over the city thinning in a circular patch directly above the facility. The same opening formed above our bay. Within both clearings, the hanging structures multiplied. Bars and lines arranged into patterns that ignored our grids, connected by geometry that cared nothing for buildings. On my instruments, the Master Gate's field began to resonate with the new node, even though their field harmonics weren't supposed to couple. The corridor between worlds had become a shared throat. A vertical column of distortion rose in the data, stitching together the sky above the dead city, the far side anchor, our bay, and the new city gate. A thread pulled through layers. "Clock," I said. "Look at channels 5 through 9. He was already leaning over his console. "Field harmonics are coupling through the grid. None of our models show this." The speaker in the corner carried the host's smooth voice from the new gate. "And today we open a path to a partner world, rich in material that would otherwise go to waste." On the demo feed, the field looked steady behind the podium. Decorations hanging from the high ceiling began to move. At first they swayed, as if someone had opened a door. Then they drifted upward, cords tightening. People pointed. Some laughed, expecting a show. In the refugee dorms, several children jerked upright on their bunks. Beads along their backs rose. One boy rolled off his bed, wedged himself under the lowest frame, and held on. The column on my board brightened. Numbers slid into ranges I'd never seen. Something above us was increasing power, testing how many points it could pull into the same line. "Kill it," I told Clark. "We shut both gates now. Orders say no shutdown unless what? Until they pull the roof. If that column keeps building, it won't stop at beams. It will tug on anything under them." We had crews in transit, refugees on pallets, visitors standing under ceilings that were turning into equipment. "We slam them. Anything in the corridor gets torn apart," Clark said. "We don't know what happens to bodies caught inside. I know what happens if we give them time to refine this." I'd been here before, in another uniform, standing on a tarmac with a manifest that didn't match the men on the ground. That day, I'd signed and let someone else carry the weight. It had buried me anyway. Julian's voice arrived on a secure channel. "Operations, hold any shutdown. There are dignitaries in that hall. We don't abort over noise in your metrics." Your noise looks like a test of pulling vectors through both gates at once, I said. Words like that terrify investors, Stone. Get technical later. For now, stabilize. That's what we pay you for. On the demo feed, an assistant walked toward the podium, hair lifting as if underwater. The field behind him brightened. Somewhere in the crowd, a child screamed. If we did nothing, we handed them 2 secure anchors in our world. If we slammed the gates, we might sever the line while it was still narrow. Those were the options. My hand closed on the master emergency cutoff. You pull that lever, Julian warned, and every casualty is on you. Not just the ones we can see, the ones in between. You'll be the man who shut the door on them. I opened it, I said. I stopped pretending otherwise a long time ago. I pulled. The master gate answered with a cascade of alarms. Field power dropped in a jagged curve, relay after relay tripping. At the same moment, I forced a linked override through to the new city gate, driving its dampers into emergency mode. In the demo hall, the field behind the podium flared, then broke. The neat oval collapsed into a ragged wound of light that narrowed fast. Anything in its grip was crushed as it closed. On both sides, cargo and people caught mid-transit were mangled beyond recognition. Fragments fused with crates and railings. One pallet carrying refugees became a twisted monument in our bay. Legs, beams, paper welded into a shape that made sense only as a record of failure. The vertical column connecting both skies thickened for a heartbeat, then shattered. The hanging forms overhead flickered, brief gaps in their continuity, and steadied again. Storm clouds flowed around them. In the dorms, the convulsing boy slackened, beads along his spine softening under his skin. Others lay under their bunks, eyes wide, feeling only that the pulling had stopped. In the demo hall, furniture lay in heaps. Some people moved, others didn't. On my boards, harmonics dropped into local noise. The corridor between worlds was closed. I had no clear picture of what I'd prevented. I knew exactly what I'd done to everyone caught between. Later, the company called it a tragic systems failure during an experimental demonstration. Internally, they recast me as the man whose prudence overreached, costing them assets and trust. They also carved up every scrap of data from that shutdown and fed it to their research teams. I learned something I think I'd always known. Close a wound by force, and you don't only stop the bleeding. You drive whatever has its hands in it deeper into the surrounding flesh. The original bay never recovered. Officially, it went offline for a comprehensive safety review. In reality, it became a laboratory. We cordoned off the worst damage. The field collapse had torn large machines and whole beams free. The floor under the mainframe had cracked, leaving jagged lines where concrete shifted. Where bodies had been halfway out of the corridor when the field collapsed, the concrete carried stains no paint could hide. We tried. Crews ground the top layer, poured fresh compound, buffed it. The marks came back, faint but visible, like bruises in stone. Standing on those spots felt different. The effect was subtle, never enough to knock you down. Weight eased along your bones. The line between you and the ceiling drew a little tighter. Metal left on those stains sometimes tipped up on one edge and stayed there, balanced against gravity until someone nudged it away. Nowhere else in the bay behaved that way. After they barred me from the main controls, I spent a lot of hours walking those circles. Internal reports framed my decision on demonstration day as an overreaction. They admitted some hazard but insisted the situation had been on track for stabilization. My shutdown became part of the damage in their version. They kept me employed. Barely. Julian and others argued for continuity of institutional knowledge. That meant they wanted what I'd learned and someone to blame. They moved me to an advisory office overlooking the bay. No levers, just access to information, endless reports from the new city gate, and plans for smaller test sites. Those plans kept me awake more than guilt. They were building micro-corridors, small field generators that could open restricted channels between our world and the other, or between parts of our own grid, depending on which document you read. Many of the rigs would sit in research parks, near power substations, under towers that already reached high into the sky. In the margins, I recognized the logic that had built the deep chamber under Jace's city. If something in the sky favors lines running from above through specific structures, you might as well use those structures as antennas. The corporation had drawn the correct lesson from the data. Whatever lives up there can manipulate lines that run through their equipment. Then, it added the lesson all their training reinforces. If you can be harvested, you can harvest. Jace met me one last time in a small conference room where the walls felt close and the ceiling too high. His escort stood at the door, hand on his weapon, watching us with polite boredom. To him, Jace was a consultant with a foreign accent and an unfortunate spine. "I heard what you did," Jace said. "You cut your own door while we were halfway through." "It was going to be cut either way," I said. "The question was who chose when." He studied my face. "On our world, commanders made those choices. They believed they were buying us time. They did in some ways. They also taught the owners above how our systems fail. Each time we broke something to stop them, they learned how to break it cleaner." My heel rested on a faint ring in the concrete under the table, one of the less active stains. "You think my shutdown taught them something?" I said. "I think your sky has weight in its ground now." He nodded toward the floor between us. "They do not need the gate open to reach for you in small ways. Your concrete remembers. Your bones have channels. They will use both. Assuming we let them. Your leaders already are." His gaze flicked toward the bay, where researchers in white coats walked among the marked circles with handheld devices. "They are testing how those stains respond to current. They are watching how your body reacts near the old frame. They see power. That is what they are trained to see." He wasn't wrong. "We know more than your people did at this point," I said, though the words felt thin. "We have your example. We know where this path leads." "Knowing and acting differ," he said. "I could not convince our council. You can try with yours." He glanced toward the bay again. "From what I have seen, you are in love with your gates. It may be a short courtship." That night, in my narrow apartment above admin, I drafted a plan. The original bay was the biggest wound. Its stains pulled harder than any other place. The gate core sat buried under that cracked concrete in reinforced housing, damaged but not dead. Research memos talked about restoring partial function for controlled experiments. If I could destroy the core and collapse the housing, then bury enough rubble in the wound, it might delay those experiments. Make this site expensive and politically ugly. That wouldn't save anyone. It might buy time. Men like me chase time even when we know how it ends. I picked a maintenance night. Systems like cycles. Humans pretend they control those cycles. The machines decide more than anyone admits. Old access codes still open doors the administrators had forgotten to update. My name still carried enough weight that night security nodded and went back to their coffee when they saw me. The bay yawned like the inside of a broken tooth. Scaffolding lined the walls where engineers had been installing sensor packages. The gate frame loomed at one end, its aperture dark, field offline. The stains glimmered in emergency lighting, deep patches in the concrete. I'd scavenged equipment over weeks. Portable field manipulators from test benches, coils meant to stabilize minor distortions, lengths of conductive scrap that looked like junk to everyone else. I didn't intend to bring the gate fully online. I meant to force a brief, concentrated resonance in the damaged core, focused through those stained spots, enough to tear the housing apart. It was demolition disguised as calibration. I set manipulators on 3 of the most responsive circles. Each unit vibrated as it wound up. Cables ran back to a central trigger behind a reinforced column. As I worked, the familiar upward tug brushed my chest. The The bolts overhead still looked dead, but they felt closer. The air had the charge of a live cable in rain. A soft footstep shifted behind me. I turned. The boy from the gallery stood just inside the bay, flanked by two researchers in pale coats. Their badges marked them as experimental field staff. One held a tablet, the other a case of sensors. "We didn't expect anyone," the one with the tablet said, frowning. "This section's cleared for measurements." I gestured toward my gear. "Recalibrating old units, stability tests. You know how many ghosts we have in this room." "We've got a scheduled series," the other said. "We're supposed to place Subject 13 on the anomalous spots and record responses." The boy watched the stains, the frame, the cables in my hands. He'd grown since I'd first seen him. The beads along his spine were more pronounced. "You're bringing him in here now?" I asked. "With the core half alive?" "Under controlled conditions," the researcher said, as if that mattered. "He's contracted for these studies. His guardians signed off." The boy's expression carried the same distant wariness I'd seen in all of them. People don't volunteer to become instruments. They just end up measured. "You know what they're about to do?" "I know I stand where they point," he said. "Sometimes the floor pulls, sometimes it does not. They write numbers either way." "This isn't your world's tunnels," I warned. "If this bay goes bad, there's no ceiling to run under." He studied my equipment, the manipulators bracketing the stains, the cables leading toward the core. "You are going to break it," he said. "That's the idea. They will build others." "I know." He walked closer. The researchers hesitated, unsure if they should call him back. "On our world," he said quietly, "some of us tried the same thing. We blew up hubs, dropped towers, cut power. Sometimes it slowed things. Mostly it gave the owners above new data. They learned how our materials fail, how our nerves behave under full load. They thanked us with better tools." "Doing nothing is also a choice," I said. "It tells them we accept the way they pull." "You come from officers," he said. "You think the only choices are full stop or full surrender. What else is there?" "Living small between their lines," he said. "We tried that too. It worked for a while." Behind him, a researcher cleared his throat. "We need to proceed," he called. "Schedule." The boy glanced at the gate. "You will not stop them with this," he told me. "You will hurt them. You will hurt us. You will teach them. Maybe that matters to you. Just understand the lesson you are choosing." "My name is already on their plans," I said. "My choices have been teaching them since the day I looked at your ruins and saw opportunity. I'm only deciding what this last one says." He nodded once, as if acknowledging a move on a board neither of us had chosen. I finished wiring the last coil. The manipulator's vibration deepened. The stains under them seemed to sink, as if the concrete wanted to become wells. "Back," I told the researchers, "behind that support." "We haven't—" "Now." Something in my tone moved them. They retreated, dragging equipment. "You too," I said to the boy. He stepped back 2 paces and stopped. "I am tied to this whether I stand far or near," he said. "I might as well see." The field in the room had shifted. The pull along my spine sharpened to a painful thread. Overhead, the old frame creaked in its moorings. I hit the trigger. The manipulators dumped their charge into the core through the stains. It didn't build gradually. It hit in a rough surge, mismatched and violent. The damaged generator responded like a wounded animal cornered too long. Vertical force yanked through the bay in jagged sections. 3 stained circles flared, lines leaping from them to the ceiling. Everything bridging those lines, columns, beams, the gate frame, jerked as if something had tried to snatch them away and almost managed it. My boots left the floor. I hung there, not high, just enough for gravity to lose its grip. Invisible wires dug into bones, lifting and twisting without regard for joints. Beside me, the boy rose a handspan, back arched, beads along his spine glowing under his shirt like a chain of embers. The core let go. The line snapped. The frame tore free on one side and crashed down with a crack that shook dust from every surface. Concrete split in slabs. Scaffolding folded. The stained circles blew shallow craters, as if something beneath had punched upward and shattered itself against the load. I hit the floor hard. Air left my lungs in a single impact. Pain flared through my ribs and down my leg. For a while there was only dust and the wail of alarms. When it cleared, the gate core was a mangled mass under concrete and steel. The stains had become rubble. They dug me out. They pulled the boy free, unconscious but breathing. The researchers, by luck or line geometry, had been thrown clear. No one stood directly under the main vertical line when it peaked. The company opened another inquiry. Publicly, it was an internal accident during decommissioning. Privately, sabotage. They didn't hand me to the prosecutors. They moved me to a medical unit inside the compound under guard, wrapped in machines that watched every flicker along my nerves. Anytime someone ran a field near me, an imaging device, a test coil, the readings went wrong. Thin, focused tugs ran through my bones whenever any corridor in the network powered up. I'd become a barometer for a storm that never truly left. From my bed, I watched the city through a reinforced window. The original facility sat half-ruined, covered in tarps and scaffolding. Plans already mentioned repurposing the site. Research park, memorial, new infrastructure. Nobody leaves ground like that empty. On the horizon, the new city gates enclosure stood intact. At certain angles, when clouds shifted, I saw shapes hanging above it. Not clearly, never straight on. Just dark masses that held position while ordinary weather drifted, linked by faint lines. Smaller distortions glinted elsewhere in the sky. Over dense neighborhoods, over transformers, over micro-corridor test sites. Thin streaks that caught the light wrong, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Inside me, the same old tug answered them. It never quite lifted me from the bed, but every time my head turned toward an active node, something along my spine tightened. The beads the refugees carried had once been called listeners. Whatever lives above us clearly has more than one ear now. Snatches of news filtered in. The new gate was operational under stricter protocols. Interworld residents, no one called them refugees anymore, were being relocated into controlled housing near active nodes. Executives wrote about vertical extraction events as new avenues for power and transport. All my sabotage had bought was one fewer large, damaged gate in their toolkit, and another batch of data on how stains in concrete behave under force. I thought of the bodies under the towers of Jace's world, of implants along their spines, grown or installed, acting as shield and channel, of the sensor spike in the deep chamber when it passed over me. I don't follow religion. Fate has never held much weight with me. Patterns do. I know a repeated mistake when I see one. People like me were always going to stand closest to the gate. We were always going to sign off on a certain level of risk in exchange for throughput. We were always going to hurt people we never met by making choices with partial information. Whatever waits above has had plenty of time to learn that about us. Now it has more than one world's worth of data. On evenings when the sky over the city takes on that wrong, layered look, I lie in my bed and feel something along my spine tighten. Lights in the distance lift a fraction of an inch on their mounts, then settle. Technicians come in and adjust coils around my chest. They watch their screens and talk about response curves and sensitivity. They flinch when indicators swing too far. I don't tell them that in those moments I feel observed from both directions at once. The gate in the bay is gone. The wound remains. New cuts open every month, dressed up as progress. I used to think my job was to guard one door. Now I understand. Once a world teaches something how to reach down from its sky, every straight line under that sky starts to look like an invitation. My name sits on the old manifests. My signature decorates the safety certifications. My bones answer when the vertical forces flex. I'm not special. I'm one more man who stood long enough beside the first gate for my employers and the owners above to learn my habits. They learn fast. So do we. We just keep choosing different lessons.